Okay, Samson, perhaps you want to introduce yourself to our fellow students?
Hello, hi students, hi class. My name is Samson Mbewe. I'm from Cape Town, South Africa. I work for an organization called South North. We do quite a lot of work around climate finance, climate science, the broad spectrum of sustainable development, energy, as well as knowledge brokering. I'm an economist by training and also an energy, both an energy and sort of macroeconomist. And I work on a lot of quantitative sort of kind of work, extending from financial modeling down to policy design, etc., etc. And so I work on across a number of sectors, particularly as far as climate finance is concerned. But my focus at the moment is the energy sector and how we begin to align financial flows with the Paris Agreement in order to realize mitigation and adaptation goals.
So we're here with Samson, kind of expert with finance, and we want to ask him some questions. The first one is, which are your expectations for this COP26? These are a question we made to everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. I think this is a very, very important question, and it's also a very broad question. And so, I mean, in responding to this question, I will very much focus on my area of interest in a lot of the work that I do, which revolves around climate finance, and in particular, Article 21C of the Paris Agreement. And so Article 21C of the Paris Agreement talks about making financial flows consistent with pathways to low emission and climate resilient development. However, what we've established over time, or as it's indicated in the Paris Agreement, Article 21C is vaguely defined, right? And there isn't a standard definition around what it means to align financial flows with the Paris Agreement. There isn't a standard definition or a clear understanding on how a lot of this is conceptualized and could be operationalized. So one of the key things I would expect from COP26 is a more clear understanding on how we operationalize Article 21C, a more harmonized sort of definition on how we could track progress around Article 21C, because it's very important to have a clear standard definition to not only allow for transparency, but also to allow for robust data collection and a clear methodology to track and determine how well aligned financial flows are with low emissions and climate resilient development pathways. Mm-hmm. Great. So what I want to see from COP26 is basically more guidance on how we define and understand Article 21C. I think this will go a very long way in ensuring that countries are able to collect the relevant data, have got a common understanding of what alignment and misalignment is, and with this in mind, and a structure of this nature in mind, it would promote transparency and the ability to also set more realistic and data-driven targets on how we align financial flows and to what extent we would like to align these financial flows and when. Great.
So the next question was, why should we invest more on adaptation than on mitigation, in your opinion?
So I think this is also a good question. And in my opinion, it's not mainly about whether, we should invest more in adaptation or mitigation, but I think it's a bit more of, it's a complex question in the sense that both mitigation and adaptation are very important. But first, it's important to understand that, mitigation is basically the actions we take to limit greenhouse gas emissions. However, it's important to recognize that despite our efforts, the climate will continue to change, and communities, societies, and countries in the world will be confronted by the impacts of climate change, extending from extreme weather conditions, rising sea levels, global warming, etc., etc. And the issue is that in thinking about financing, I think there is a strong need to increase financing to very poor countries who, in most cases, are not really responsible for a lot of a lot of the challenges or the impacts of climate change that we are experiencing at the moment, given their emissions profile, which is close to low and almost non-existent in certain cases. So there is a need to really emphasize the polluter pays principle, and I think there is a need for increased financing from more developed countries to support locally led adaptation efforts in many of their developing countries. And of course, this can be done concurrently, to support both mitigation and adaptation efforts. Of course, one would argue and say that, maybe mitigation, for instance, in the energy sector in developing countries may not be a priority of some sort, but because given their emissions intensity is so low. But what happens in cases where you've got countries that continue to discover carbon assets such as coal, oil, and gas, and in the medium to long term, how do you deal with those kind of issues? How do you employ a managed transition, allow them to exploit their mineral resources, and then eventually transition to more cleaner sort of fuels? These are some of the questions that one needs to think about. Or do you get to compensate these countries for not using their fossil fuel resources and allow them to transition to a more climate resilient sort of development? Because it's the key issue is that we need to think about development in a dynamic way, and you realize that a number of developing countries that continue to exploit their fossil fuels, it's mainly as a result of the fact that most of their budgets and their fiscal revenue is derived from extracting carbon assets, and their balance of payments are mostly financed or stabilized by exporting fossil fuels. And so these are very key development questions that one needs to sort of think about quite clearly. And in mitigating and adapting to climate change, it needs to be done in a holistic approach that takes into account promoting sustainable development and not at the expense of climate change or cost-cutting objectives. Yeah.
Okay. What's the role of private finance on promoting climate action?
So, that's a very, very good question, in the sense that what we've come to establish, and it's very pronounced within the literature and emerging reports, is that there's a very substantive financing gap towards climate action. And of course, over time we've seen investment flows, public investment flows into supporting climate action. But investment flows are just not enough to help us reach our mitigation targets and limit greenhouse gas emissions. Equally, public investment flows are not sufficient to help us reach our adaptation goals. And so, but however, we need to understand that the importance of private finance cannot be viewed in isolation. Both private finance and public finance need to work together in order to promote climate action. And one of the key aspects of public finance is to create the enabling environment for private finance to flourish, to thrive. So you could use public finance to leverage private investment. And how do you do this? This is through creating an enabling framework in a lot of the developing countries that are in strong need of increased private sector participation. And this could happen across a number of sectors, be it energy sector, transport, etc., etc. But it's also important to acknowledge that private finance as well has got a key role to play in promoting climate action when you look at it from the perspective of the role that institutional investors and fund managers, particularly and private equity, have to play towards realizing climate action. We know, and it's very well established, that public finance maximizes social welfare, private finance maximizes profits. But there is a strong need to create actions that allow private finance or incentivize private finance to take a leading role towards supporting climate action. And a lot of this would need to create certain levers, and one of which could include creating making regulation around how private finance invests in development. That is, by all means, making sure that private finance moves away from financing, high, sort of carbon investments through down to low carbon investments. And this is where the key issue of, transparency sort of comes in, and key issues around voluntary disclosure. And so disclosure becomes very, very important for companies, in the sense that once it's part of the regulation, it means companies would need to disclose their micro and macro prudential climate and investment risks, be it in their strategy or as required by regulation. And I think what's also important to understand for private investment and perhaps private companies is a so-called double materiality concept. It's sort of a new concept that talks about double materiality talks about the impact of finance and corporate activities on the climate, and also the impact of climate on finance and corporate activities, which is very, very important. And the issue is that we've been viewing this, mostly the discourse is focused on viewing the impact of climate change on finance and corporate activities. But we also need to think about and quantify the impact of, corporates and finance on climate change. And these are very important discussions, and this is how we get to change behavior. So one of the key things that is important here is to change behavior of private finance, and to incentivize private finance to undertake more climate resilient development projects over time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay.
The last question we wanted to ask you is, you told us off camera that you're involved in some projects, so perhaps you could explain one or two of those projects you are involved in.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm currently working on a very new project which is focusing on aligning financial flows with Article 210 of the Paris Agreement. And as I would have indicated earlier on, Article 210 of the Paris Agreement talks about making financial flows, consistent with low emissions and climate resilient development. However, there is lack of a standard definition around how you align financial flows, and that is quite challenging, which has resulted in a country-level conceptualization of how we begin to think about aligning financial flows. And that is a bit problematic because it's very difficult to track, alignment of financial flows across countries. And this warranties a discussion around the need for a standardized definition. But what becomes important is that if countries are to align financial flows, we need to take into account the different circumstances or characteristics thereof. So for a continent like Africa, you get to establish that, the growth trajectory or the profile of many countries is, very much hinged on, resource-based growth, which is exploitation or extraction of mineral resources and carbon fuels to finance the fiscal revenue and the balance of payments. And so I'm working on this project where we are looking to develop the evidence base on how Africa should align its financial flows. So we'll be developing a pathway paper that will look at the role of asset managers, fund managers, sovereign wealth funds, pension funds in creating opportunities for the realignment of financial flows. We'll further be looking at establishing the evidence base for safeguarding assets of the poor people as it relates to access to energy and new technologies. We'll also be working on a pathway paper that looks at creating options for countries that have recently discovered carbon assets and how they begin to exist in what we would call a managed transition, or a case where there is an opportunity for a more developed countries to help support or compensate for any loss in the stranded assets that this country would need to forgo as a result of pursuing climate resilient development. We will also be developing a pathway paper that looks at examining the options for realigning financial flows in infrastructure development. I think this is a very, very important aspect, especially on the African continent, in the sense that there is a lot of ongoing investment spending on infrastructure, and a lot of this is dominated by the Chinese. And there is a need to establish an evidence base to effectively look at how well aligned these financial flows are, with the Paris Agreement. And cool. Thanks.
Okay, that's it. Well, Samson Mbewe from South Africa, thank you so much for your time and your attention and for your explanations.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We do
Great.
appreciate it.
Great.